From their vantage point, parked across the road, they watched the vampires, once again in their blue overalls, walk up the steps and enter the gleaming art gallery. They were chatting and didn't look intimidating at all. A few minutes later, the staff and day shift security started to trickle out of the building. When every one of them was accounted for, Skulduggery reached into the back seat and pulled the black bag into his lap. "We're going now?" Stephanie asked, looking up into the evening sky. "But it's still bright." "And that's precisely why we're going now," he said. 20 minutes from now, there'll be 2 fully-fledged vampires prowling around in there. I want to get in, find out how to destroy the scepter, and get out before that happens." "Ah, probably wise." "Very probably." They got out of the horrible canary car and crossed the street, left the pavement and moved through the garden area to a tall tree behind the gallery. Making sure they wouldn't be seen, Skulduggery put the bag over his shoulder and started to climb. Stephanie jumped for the lowest branch, grabbed it, and started climbing up after him. She hadn't done anything like this in years, but climbing a tree was like falling out of one. Easy. The tree's limbs were long and strong, and they quickly came adjacent to the gallery's roof, which was ridged with a dozen skylights. Stephanie hoisted herself up on a branch and sat there, regarding the large gap between building and tree with curiosity. It looked too far to jump. "You sure I can't come with you?" Stephanie asked. "I need you out here in case something goes terribly, terribly wrong." "Like what?" "Oh, any one of a number of things." "Fills me with confidence, that," she muttered. Skulduggery manoeuvred himself onto the longest branch and then walked along it, bent-legged and stooped over. His balance was unnatural, but there was still that gap. Without pausing, he sprang forward off the branch. He brought his arms up by his sides and out in front, and a tremendous gust of wind buffeted him over to the rooftop. Stephanie promised herself that one day she'd get him to teach her how to do that. Skulduggery looked back. "The gallery is outfitted with the most elaborate security systems," he said as he opened the bag. "But because of the vampires, the alarms on the outer corridors are never set, so once I get by the main hall, it should be plain sailing, as they say." "As who say?" "I don't know. People who sail, presumably." He opened the bag and took out a harness that he started to strap himself into. He looked up at her. "Where was I?" "I have no idea." "Oh yes, my cunning plan. I need to access a control panel on the east wall. From there, I can disable everything. The floor is pressure sensitive, so I'm going to have to stay off it, but that shouldn't be a problem for someone of my natural grace and agility." "You're very impressed with yourself, aren't you?" "Exceedingly so." He secured a thin wire onto a ventilation duct, looped it through his harness, and led it back to one of the skylights. Stephanie frowned. "You're going to lower yourself down from here?" "Yes, that's the fun bit." "Right. But you're going to have to open the skylight, yes? Won't that set off an alarm?" "Only a small one," Skulduggery said with confidence. She stared at him. "And wouldn't that be enough?" "It's a silent little thing, hooked up to the nearby police station. Or it was hooked up. I passed by their transformer box before I collected you this morning. Oddly enough, it happened to short out at the exact same time. Something to do with a large amount of water mysteriously manifesting inside. I think they're baffled. They certainly looked baffled." "And your entire plan hinges on the hope that they haven't restored electricity yet?" "Well, yes," he said, after a slight hesitation. "But anyway," he looked over at the setting sun, then back at Stephanie. "If you hear any screaming," he said, "that'll be me." He passed his hand over the lock, and it broke apart, then opened up one of the halves of the skylight and climbed over the side. She watched him disappear into it, and then heard a slight whirring as he used the handheld control to lower himself down in the harness. Stephanie sat back against the tree trunk, keeping an eye out for whatever she was supposed to be keeping an eye out for. Anything unusual. She frowned to herself, not entirely certain of what constituted unusual anymore, and then she heard an unsettling scraping noise. She looked up. The wire Skulduggery had attached to the ventilation duct was slipping. She watched in horror as it slipped again, getting closer to the edge, closer to slipping off entirely. She thought of the pressure-sensitive floor, thought about Skulduggery crashing down and setting off every alarm in the place, and the vampires running in and catching him. Although he didn't have any blood for them to drink, she was sure they'd be able to find some other ways to punish the trespass. The wire slipped again, and Stephanie knew she didn't have a choice. She crawled along the same branch Skulduggery had jumped from, and it groaned beneath her weight. Skulduggery was nothing but bones, she reminded herself, in an effort not to feel fat. The gap was gaping. It was a gaping gap. Stephanie shook her head. She couldn't make it. There was no way she could jump that. With a decent run at it, she might have had a chance, but from crouching on the end of an unsteady branch. She closed her eyes, forcing the doubts from her mind. It wasn't a choice, she reminded herself. It wasn't a question of whether she could jump or would jump. Skulduggery needed her help, and he needed it now. So it was a question of when she did jump, what would happen then. So she jumped. She stretched out, and the ground moved far beneath her, and the edge of the building rushed at her, and then she started to dip. Her right hand thudded against the edge, and her fingers gripped. The rest of her body slammed into the side of the building, and she almost fell, but she shot her left hand up to join her right and held on. She pulled herself up, little by little, until she could get an arm over the edge, and soon she was safe. She had made it. The wire slipped again. It was about to snap from the duct, and then it'd all be over. Stephanie ran to it, got her fingers around the wire, and tried to tug it down again, but it was no use. She stood, put the sole of her boot against the wire, and used all her weight to try and push it down, but she didn't make the slightest bit of difference. She looked around for something to use, saw the bag, and snatched it up. Nothing inside but more wire. She grabbed the wire and dropped to her knees, tying a new piece to the wire already attached to the harness. Her father had taught her all about knots when she was little, and although she couldn't remember the names of most of them, she knew which knot suited this occasion. With the new length of wire added, she looked around for something to secure it to. There was another skylight right in front of her. She ran to it, wrapping the wire around the entire concrete base and getting it tied off just as the first piece of wire shot off the duct. There was a sudden snap as the wire went taut again, but it stayed secure. Stephanie hurried over to the open skylight and looked down. Skulduggery was hovering right above the floor, trying to stay horizontal after the sudden drop. The motion control for the harness was still in his hand, but both arms were outstretched for maximum balance, and he couldn't move himself back up. There was a second control on the roof beside Stephanie, attached to the harness with a lead that twisted down through the skylight around the wire. Stephanie grabbed the control, jammed her finger against the up button, and Skulduggery started whirring upwards. When he was safe, he raised his head, saw her, and gave her the thumbs up. He took over the controls, positioning himself next to the wall, by the panel that he had already opened. Stephanie watched him flick a few switches, and then he spun himself gently. His feet touched the floor. No alarms went off. He undid the clasp on the harness and stepped out of it, then looked up. A moment passed, and he motioned for her to come down. Grinning, Stephanie recalled the harness, strapped herself in, climbed over the edge, and lowered herself down. Skulduggery helped her unclip it. "I suppose I could do with some backup," he whispered, and she smiled. The gallery was big and spacious and white. There were huge glass sections in the walls. The main hall was full of paintings and sculptures, artfully arranged so it was neither cluttered nor sparse. They moved to the double doors and listened intently. Skulduggery opened one of the doors, checked outside, nodded to Stephanie. They crept out, closing the door behind them. She followed him through the white corridors, around turns and through archways. She caught him glancing out of the windows as they passed. Night was coming. They got to a small alcove, away from the main hub of the gallery. Within this alcove was a heavy wooden door, crisscrossed by a grid of bolted steel. Skulduggery whispered for her to keep watch, and then hurried to the door, taking something from his pocket. Stephanie crouched where she was, peering into the ever-increasing gloom. She glanced back at Skulduggery as he worked at picking the lock. There was a window next to her. The sun had gone down. She heard footsteps and shrank back. The man in the blue overalls had appeared around the corner on the far side of the corridor opposite. He was walking slowly, like any security guard she'd seen in a mall. Casual, disinterested, bored. She felt Skulduggery sneak up behind her, but he didn't say anything. The man's hand went to his belly, and then he doubled over in pain. Stephanie wished she was closer. If he sprouted fangs, she'd hardly be able to see them from here. The man straightened up and arched his spine, and the sounds of his bones cracking echoed through the corridor. Then he reached up and grabbed his hair and pulled his skin off. Stephanie stifled a gasp. In one fluid movement he had pulled it all off. Hair, skin, clothes. and he was pale underneath, and bald, and his eyes were big and black. He moved like a cat, kicking off the remnants of his human form. She didn't have to be closer to see his fangs. They were big and jagged and hideous, and now she was quite content to be viewing them from a distance. These weren't the vampires she'd seen on TV. These weren't sexy people in long coats and sunglasses. These were animals. She felt Skulduggery's hand on her shoulder, and he pulled her back a fraction, very gently, just before the vampire looked over. It moved away from them, down the corridor, in search of prey. Stephanie followed Skulduggery to the door, and they passed through and closed it behind them. Skulduggery wasn't creeping anymore, but Stephanie didn't dare make a sound. He led the way down beneath the gallery, a flame in his hand lighting the steps. It was cold down here. They were in an old corridor now, with heavy doors on either side, and they walked until they came to a door with a crest etched into it, a shield and a bear. Skulduggery raised both hands and lowered his head and didn't move for almost a minute. Then the door clicked, and they stepped in. Skulduggery clicked his fingers, and candles flared up all around the chamber. There were books piled on books, and artifacts and statues and paintings and wood carvings, and there was even a suit of armor to one side. "This is all to do with the scepter?" Stephanie asked in a whisper. "It's all to do with the ancients," Skulduggery answered. "So I'm sure there must be something about the scepter and all this. I honestly didn't expect there to be this much. You don't have to whisper, by the way. There are vampires above us. These chambers are sealed. I broke the locking seal, but the sound seal is still in place. Did you know locking seals have to be dismantled every single time you want to go through, and then crafted again once you leave? I don't see what's wrong with a good old-fashioned key. That would certainly keep someone like me out. Well, until I knocked the door down." "What's a sound seal?" Stephanie whispered. "Oh, even if they were standing outside the door and you were shouting at the top of your voice, they wouldn't hear you." "Ah," she said. "Okay then." But she still kept her voice low. They started searching. Some of the books were about the legends of the ancients, some took a more practical and analytical viewpoint, and some were written in a language Stephanie didn't recognize. A few of the books held nothing but blank pages, yet Skulduggery seemed able to read them, although he said they contained nothing of immediate interest. She started rooting through a collection of paintings, stacked in frames against the wall. A lot of them showed people holding the scepter aloft and looking heroic. The paintings toppled over, and she stooped to push them back up. She looked at the painting in front of her, recognizing it from the book she had seen in Skulduggery's car, a man shielding his eyes from a glowing scepter as he reached for it. This was the full painting, not the truncated little rectangle on a page. Skulduggery glanced over as Stephanie put the pictures back as she had found them. She approached the suit of armor, noting the shield and bear etched into the breastplate. "Family crest?" she asked. "Sorry," Skulduggery said, looking up. "Oh, yes, we don't have family names that we can keep, so crests serve as our only link to our ancestors." "Do you have a crest?" He hesitated. "I used to. I don't anymore." She turned. "Why not?" "I abandoned it, actually." "Why?" "You ask an awful lot of questions." "When I grow up, I want to be a detective just like you." He looked over and saw her grinning. He laughed. "I suppose you do share my penchant for raising Cain." "Raising what now?" "It's an old expression. It means to make trouble." "Well, why can't you say, make trouble? Why do you always have to use these words that I don't know?" "You should read more." "I read enough. I should get out more." Skulduggery held a small box up to the light, turning it over in his hands and examining it from every angle. "What's that?" she asked. "It's a puzzle box." "Can't you play with it some other time?" "The purpose of a puzzle box, its whole raison d'être, is to be solved." "What kind of raison?" "Raison d'être. It's French for reason to be." "There you go again. Why didn't you just say reason to be? Why do you have to complicate things?" "My point is, leaving a puzzle box unsolved is like leaving a song unsung. It may as well cease to exist." There's a crossword in the paper my dad gets every single day. He starts it, ends up making up nonsensical words to fill in the blanks, and abandons it. I'll give you every paper we have lying about the house if you put that down and get back to searching. I've given up searching. She stared at him. And they say my generation has a short attention span. That painting you were looking at. Notice anything strange about it? There were a lot of paintings. The man reaching for the scepter. What about it? Did you notice anything unusual about it? Stephanie went over to the wall again, moved the frames one by one till she came to the painting he was talking about. Okay, unusual like how? Describe it to me. She moved the others out of the way so she could take a better look. There's this man. He's reaching for the scepter. It's glowing. And that's it. Nothing strange about him. No, not really. She frowned. Well, yes. The scepter's really bright, and he's got one hand shielding his eyes, but both eyes are wide open. So, if it's really that bright, you'd kind of expect him to be squinting at least, even if it is just a picture? Anything else strike you as a little off? She scanned the painting. The shadows. What about them? He's got two of them. So? The scepter is magical, remember? It could be casting two shadows as easy as one for whatever bizarre, magical reason. But the scepter isn't casting these shadows, the angles are wrong. So what would cause that? Two different light sources? And what is the primary source of light? The sun? If it is the sun, what time of day would it be? Well, the shadow at his feet would make it noon, when the sun is directly overhead, but the shadow behind him would make it either morning or evening. Which one? How should I know? It's behind him, so it might be morning. So what you're looking at is a painting of a man reaching for the scepter, seeing everything at a time when it is both the past and the present. I suppose so. What does this have to do with the puzzle box? Who painted it? Stephanie peered at the bottom corner. There's no name, only a crest. A leopard and crossed swords. Skulduggery raised the puzzle box for her to see what was carved into its base. A leopard and crossed swords. Right, she said, standing. Guessing games are over. That painting tells us that the painter, or the painter's family, can offer us a glimpse into the past. And that is what we in the profession call a clue. A clue is part of a mystery. A mystery is a puzzle. I hold in my hands a puzzle box. Skulduggery's fingers played over the surface of the box, and Stephanie saw his head tilt. He pressed his hands against opposite sides, making subtle rotations until something clicked. There was a noise, like the whirring of a motorized part, and the top of the box opened to reveal a blue gemstone. Ah, Skulduggery said. Stephanie peered closer. The gem was a little bigger than a golf ball. What is it? It's an echo stone, he said. Very rare. Generally, it's used by people who are dying. They sleep with the stone close by for 3 nights, and in doing so they imprint it with their memories and personality. It's given to loved ones to help comfort them through their grief, or to answer any lingering questions they might have. Things like that. How does it work? I'm not entirely sure, he said. I've never seen one up close. He pressed a fingertip to the stone, and it immediately started to glow. His head tilted again, and he sounded very pleased with himself. Would you look at that? I'm such a genius. You just touched it. Still a genius, Stephanie. She sighed. A moment slipped by, and then an old man faded up from nothing before them. Stephanie stepped back. Don't be alarmed, the old man said, smiling. He was wearing a robe, and he had kind eyes. I'm not going to hurt you, young lady. I'm here to answer questions, and provide whatever information I can to assist you in your... His voice trailed off. He was looking at Skulduggery. My, oh my, you're a skeleton. I am. As I live and breathe, figuratively speaking, of course, as I neither live nor breathe, but a skeleton, a talking skeleton at that. I am very impressive, Skulduggery said. Who are you?
My name is Oisin, and I am here to answer whatever questions you may have.
Well, that's good news, because we're looking for a few answers.
How did you manage that, then?
Oisin asked. I'm sorry?
Becoming a skeleton, that's a new one on me.
Well, it's a long story. Oisin waved his hand.
Better not tell me. This stone will only work for a short while before it needs to be charged. I don't have a lot of time to give you the answers you seek.
Then we'd better start.
Yes, we had better. Was it painful, though, losing your flesh?
I don't mean to be rude, Oisin, but aren't you the one supposed to be answering questions, not asking them? Oisin laughed.
I admit I'm a little too curious for my own good. On the other hand, I do have an in-depth knowledge of the stories of the ancients, so, in many ways, I'm the ideal candidate. Better suited to this than my colleagues, believe me. Before we get started, could I ask what century this is?
The 21st, Stephanie said.
21st!
He repeated, laughing with delight.
Oh my! So this is what the future looks like, eh? Kind of gloomy and cluttered. I always thought it'd be brighter, you know. So what's been happening in the world?
You want us to tell you everything you missed?
Well, not everything, just the high points. What language am I speaking, by the way?
Stephanie frowned. English.
English, eh? Marvelous! I've never spoken English before. How does it sound?
Fine, I suppose. Does the stone translate what you're saying?
Yes, it does. I could have used something like this on my travels. I'll tell you that much. It would have really impressed the ladies.
He started to chuckle, then stopped.
Not that I travelled far, or at all. I don't trust boats, you see. If nature had intended us to travel across water, we would have been provided with fins.
Can we ask you a question? Skulduggery asked. Again, I don't want to be rude, but if the stone runs out of power before we learn what we need... The old man clapped his hands and rubbed them together.
Of course, my boy. Say no more. Ask me your first question.
You're an expert on the ancients.
Yes, I am. I'm the one charged with the task of documenting their existence. It's a great honor, even if it does leave me with precious little time to travel. Not that I would, even if I could, but it'd be nice to have options, you know.
Yes, anyway, we need to know about the scepter. We need to know its power. Oisin nodded.
The scepter of the ancients was created to destroy, and destroy it does. There is nothing that will not crumble to dust under its glare.
Is there any kind of defense against it? Oisin shook his head.
No shield, no spell, no barrier. It can't be stopped and it can't be destroyed.
What about its power source? Stephanie asked.
A single crystal, a black crystal, embedded in its hilt, capable of channeling the energy that's poured into it.
And can the crystal be destroyed? Oisin gave a little frown.
I've thought about this, actually. I know more about the scepter than anyone else since the time of the ancients. Certainly more than any of my colleagues. And while there is no record of a weakness, we have translations of texts that suggest the crystal can be destroyed from within.
How? Stephanie asked.
I don't really know.
Who created the scepter? Skulduggery asked. Oisin puffed out his chest.
The scepter was created by the ancients as a weapon to be used against their gods. For 1 year they toiled, out of sight and in darkness, so that the gods could not see what they were creating.
His chest deflated and he smiled.
That's a direct quote from one of the first texts we found. I found it, actually. The others were so jealous. That's probably why they didn't want me to be the one to answer your questions.
Stephanie frowned. You're not supposed to be here?
We had a vote. I voted for me. No one else did. They're just jealous. They said I'd waste time, talk too much. So I stole the stone and went away for a few days to imprint it with my consciousness. They can't imprint anything over it, you see. And now here I am.
He beamed. Then his whole body faded, became suddenly transparent, and his beaming smile vanished.
No, time seems to be running out. If you have any more questions...
Who created the crystal? Skulduggery asked quickly.
Well, if you'll allow me to quote from the text that I discovered. The faceless ones created the crystal, and the crystal sang to the faceless ones when an enemy neared. But when the ancients approached, the crystal was silent, and it did not sing to the faceless ones, and the faceless ones did not know it was taken.
So their security system had a blind spot, Stephanie said.
It looks that way,
Oisin said, nodding. His image grew even fainter, and he held up a hand and gazed through it.
This is sort of unnerving.
The scepter has returned, Skulduggery said. Oisin looked up.
What?
It was uncovered recently, then hidden again. We need to know how to find it.
Oh my,
Oisin said.
If the wrong sort of person takes possession of the scepter...
It'll be bad, we know. Oisin, how do we find it? The old man vanished for a moment, then flickered back into sight.
I don't know, dear boy. Who hid it?
My uncle, Stephanie said. He realized it was too powerful for anyone to own.
A wise man, it seems. Of course, a truly wise man would return it to the place he found it. Failing that, somewhere similar.
Skulduggery straightened. Of course. A smile popped up on Oisin's face.
Have I helped you?
You have. I know where it is. Thank you, Oisin. Oisin nodded proudly.
I knew I could do this. I knew I could answer questions and not talk too much. That's what I told them right before they called for a vote. I said, listen, I can...
And he vanished, and the echo stone stopped glowing. Stephanie looked at Skulduggery. Well? Gordon followed the example of the last of the ancients and buried the scepter deep within the earth. It's in the caves. What caves? Beneath Gordon's land is a network of caves and tunnels stretching for miles in each direction. It's a death trap, even for the most powerful sorcerer. Why? There are creatures in those caves who feed off magic. It would be the safest place to hide the scepter. I should have thought of it sooner. Beneath Gordon's house, a world of magic and wonder Stephanie never knew was there. Bit by bit, she was seeing how close magic had been to her when she was growing up. If only she had known where to look. It was such a strange sensation. But what had Skulduggery told her when they were about to enter the sanctuary? Better get used to that feeling. Skulduggery closed his hand over the puzzle box, and the top slid over, hiding the echo stone once again. Maybe Oisin has more information, Stephanie said. How long does it take to recharge the stone? About a year. She blinked. Oh, well. Okay then, that's probably a little too long. Still, who knows what else he could help people with. I'm sure it'll be invaluable to, folks who are interested in history. Historians like... Actually, we can't tell anyone we were here. You could tell Ghastly. I'm sure he'd forgive the little trespass if you told him what we'd found. Not really. See, this is his family's chamber. It's a sacred thing. Us being here is inexcusable. What? You said this was just like a storage shed. You didn't say anything about it being sacred. Now you know why I have difficulty keeping friends. Skulduggery put the box back where he had found it. Stephanie was still staring at him. Is this disrespectful? She asked. Is this like dancing on someone's grave? A little worse than that, he admitted. It's like digging up that grave, taking out the body, rifling through its pockets, and then dancing on the whole thing. It's a little more than disrespectful. Then yes, she said as he walked over. I can see why you have difficulty keeping friends. Skulduggery waved his hand and every candle in the chamber flickered out. They were plunged into darkness. Stephanie opened the door and peeked out. The corridor was long and silent and empty. She stepped out and Skulduggery followed, closing the door behind them. They crept along the corridor, up the stone steps and out of the wood and iron door. They moved quickly through the gallery. The corners were the worst, as they were always expecting a vampire to round them just as they approached. They were nearing the main hall when Skulduggery held up his hand. Ahead of them, crouching in the middle of the corridor, was a vampire. Stephanie stopped breathing. Its back was to them, so they moved backwards, careful not to make a sound. They were just turning when Stephanie saw something out of the corner of her eye. She clutched Skulduggery's arm. The other vampire was approaching from the opposite direction. They sank behind a marble pillar, trapped. Across from them was an archway leading into another section of the gallery, but Stephanie was pretty sure that even if they made it through without being seen, they'd be cut off. Their only way out was back in the main hall with the harness, but their chances of making it without being torn to pieces were getting slimmer with every moment. Skulduggery had his powers, and he had his gun, but she knew he didn't hold out much hope that he'd be able to fend off one of those creatures, let alone two. He turned to her, hand raised, one finger pointing at her, then pointing at the ground. Stay. That finger pointing at himself, then pointing at the arch. Go. Stephanie's eyes widened, and she shook her head, but now that finger was pressed to his mouth. If he'd had lips, she knew his finger would be on them. She didn't want to. She didn't want to agree to this, but she knew she had no choice. Skulduggery took his gun from his jacket and passed it to her, and gave her a nod, and then immediately sprang up and lunged for the arch. The vampire approaching from behind saw him and broke into a run. The vampire up ahead turned and sprang off its haunches, and Stephanie shrank back as it passed the pillar and took off through the archway, joining the hunt for the intruder. The gun was surprisingly heavy in her hand as Stephanie crept out and started running for the main hall. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the dark corridors, but she didn't care. The only thing going through her mind was the fact that she needed to get out. She took each corner quickly, knowing the threat was behind her, and every time she took a corner, she let herself glance back. Empty corridor. Nothing coming for her. Not yet. She was approaching the main hall. Just a few more turns and she'd be there. She tucked the gun into her coat. She'd need both hands to strap herself into the harness. She turned the next corner and skidded to a stop. No, this couldn't be right. She looked up at the blank wall, her eyes wide. This couldn't be right. This wall should not have been here. She'd taken a wrong turn. She'd taken a wrong turn in this stupid gallery, and now she didn't know where she was. She was lost. She turned away from the dead end, wanting to scream at herself in frustration. She hurried back the way she had come, glancing through every arch and doorway she passed, looking for something she recognized. Everything looked the same in the gloom. Why weren't there any signs? Where were the signs? There was an intersecting corridor up ahead. Could that be it? Stephanie tried remembering their trail from the hall to the iron door and mentally reversing it. Had they turned at an intersecting corridor? She cursed herself for not paying attention, cursed herself for relying on Skulduggery to lead the way. They must have come from there. Every turn behind her seemed to lead to the dead end, so they must have come from there. She was 10 paces from the intersecting corridor when the vampire emerged from a small hall up ahead. It saw her instantly. She didn't even have time to duck down. The corridor was 10 paces away. The vampire was about 30 paces beyond that. She couldn't go back. If she went back, she'd be cut off. She had to go forward. She didn't have a choice. Stephanie bolted. The vampire kicked off and bounded towards her. It was going to cover the 30 paces faster than she would cover the 10. They ran straight at each other, and the vampire leapt. Stephanie dropped and slid beneath it, and she felt the rushing air as it passed overhead. She came out of the slide on her feet and twisted her body, then sprinted down the intersecting corridor. This was it. She recognized the statue. Only a few more turns. She heard the vampire behind her. Every corner she turned cost her precious moments, but the vampire just leapt to the outer wall and sprang diagonally to the wall beyond the corner. It was closing the distance between them. Stephanie burst through the doors to the main hall, and Skulduggery was there, launching himself at the vampire as it reached for her. They crashed backwards and tumbled. "Get out of here!" Skulduggery shouted, kicking the vampire away and scrambling to his feet. Stephanie grabbed the harness and hit the button. Her arms were almost jerked out of their sockets as the harness withdrew. She rose to the skylight too fast, and when the harness hit the top, she lost her grip. She managed to get one hand around the edge of the skylight as her body swung wildly. Her other hand clawed on, and she gritted her teeth and pulled herself up. Her head and shoulders emerged into the night air, and she hauled herself up the rest of the way to tumble out onto the roof. Fighting to catch her breath, she immediately went back to the skylight and looked down, just in time to see the vampire leap. She cried out and fell backwards as the vampire burst through the closed section of the skylight, showering her with glass. It hit the roof in a crouch. Stephanie didn't even have time to get to her feet before it dived at her. She turned away, and its claws raked across her coat, but didn't penetrate the material, although the impact slammed her to the roof again. The vampire overshot, but spun as soon as it landed, snarling. Its fangs dripped with saliva, and its eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, neither of them made a move. Then Stephanie slowly got to her hands and knees. The vampire hissed, but she didn't break eye contact. She tucked her feet beneath her and squatted. The vampire was waiting for her to make a sudden move. The gun was in her pocket, but she didn't go for it. Stephanie moved slowly. She kept her eyes open, didn't blink, didn't do anything that might give it an excuse to resume its attack. Her knees straightened, though she stayed bent over. She took her first step, to her left. The vampire moved with her. Its eyes blazed with sheer animal ferocity. All it wanted to do was rip her apart. All it wanted was her complete and utter annihilation. She forced herself to keep calm. "Easy, boy," she said softly, and the vampire snapped at the air. Its claws clicked against themselves. Even though they hadn't pierced her coat, her back was throbbing in pain. She knew that if it hadn't been for whatever material this coat was made from, that single swipe would have killed her. The vampire began moving towards her. Stephanie started to back away, but the moment she tried moving her foot behind her, the vampire's hackles rose. She froze. If it leapt from that distance, it would be on her before she knew what was happening. It kept coming, moving slowly, stalking its prey. The second skylight exploded, and then everything was happening too fast. The vampire broke its eye lock and lunged, but Stephanie was already moving, twisting to the side as the claws lacerated the space where she had just been. The other vampire was on the roof and closing in, and Stephanie sprinted for the edge of the building and she jumped. Her legs hit branches, and she flipped over and was crashing headlong into the tree and falling. She smacked from one branch to the next, each impact spinning her and making her cry out. She hit a branch with her ribs, and the breath rushed out of her, and still she fell. Then there were no more branches, and for a moment it was just her and the sound of rushing air. And then the ground slammed into her from behind. Stephanie lay on the grass, trying to breathe. She could see the tree. She could see the gallery. She could see the sky. Something was falling towards her. Two things, two figures dropping from the edge of the building. The vampires hit the ground and came at her. The window to her left shattered, and the security alarm pierced the night. Skulduggery landed in front of her. He thrust his hand out, and the air shimmered, and he caught one of the vampires, sending it hurtling back. The second one kept coming, and Skulduggery threw fire at it, but it leapt, cleared the flame, and landed with both feet on Skulduggery's chest. They went down, and Stephanie's body started obeying her again. She got up, still struggling to breathe. The vampire swiped, and Skulduggery's shirt parted, and he cried out in pain. Stephanie wrapped both arms around the vampire's neck and pulled back. It hissed and flailed, and Stephanie stumbled back to avoid its claws. Skulduggery sat up, and he pressed his hand against the vampire. The vampire shot backwards like it had been fired from a cannon. It hit the wall of the building with a sickening thwack and fell to the ground, and didn't get up. Stephanie grabbed Skulduggery's arm and dragged him to his feet, and they ran for the car.